If you're a Canadian, you absolutely know Tim Hortons already. If you aren't Canadian, Tim Hortons is kind of like the equivalent to Dunkin in the USA. There's 3,569 Tim Hortons locations in Canada. 1,800 locations of those are in Ontario alone. And a lot of Americans might think that's not a lot of locations, but you got to remember the population of all of Canada is under 40 million people. That's not much more than reside in the state of California. And here in Canada, most people think that Tim Hortons owners must be making an absolute fortune because no matter the time of day you drive by a Tim Hortons, there's a huge lineup. Customers are usually blocking out the streets. Now, that reason to buy a Tim Hortons, because there's a long lineup, or any franchise for that matter, is included in our top 10 stupid reasons to buy a franchise list. Because guess what? You don't get paid on lineups. You get paid on profit margins. And if the margins are bad, doesn't matter how big your lineups are, you're not going to make good money. We'll speak to that in a moment. We did a video on Tim Hortons way back in 2018. We only had 2,000 subscribers at the time, and I pointed out reasons why Tim Hortons may not be as great an investment as people think. And since that time, average EBITDA, which is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, has dropped by over $100,000 a year average for franchise owners, some of them a lot higher. So if you ever wondered how much do these Tim Horton owners make, back in 2018, the average EBITDA across the system was around $320,000 a year. That's not bad, but that number as of last year dropped to $220,000. Then, of course, minus your interest, your taxes, etc. Now, $200,000 is not bad money, but keep in mind how much work is involved: hiring, training, attrition, customer satisfaction in one of the highest volume environments in food. And guess what? An employee doesn't show up, guess who has to cover for them? And we're in a very aggressive environment right now in terms of hiring people. Also keep in mind, a traditional store, a Tim Hortons, can cost up to $2 million to open, and that does not even include your real estate. And to buy a Tim Hortons, you need to have a net worth of $1.5 million, and you need to have $500,000 liquid, unencumbered cash to even be considered. So the number one on our list of red flags for Tim Hortons is declining profits and low margins. And remember, $220,000, that is the average. Keep in mind, around half of the Tim Hortons stores earn even less money than that. Now ask yourself, is that a good return on an investment of $1 to $2 million? Next issue is location. Now, as someone new to the Tim Hortons franchise system, you get whatever locations are left over. The first 4,000 owners that are in the system, obviously they pick the best locations that are out there. Also keep in mind, Tim Hortons offers existing owners any new location that comes up first. They get first dibs. Whatever nobody wants, that goes to the new buyer. This is why getting in with an emerging franchise brand, a newer franchise brand, can be a good strategy. It's similar to people who bought into Tim Hortons decades ago. They made a lot of money and they got all of the best territory. Speaking of territory, that's our number 3. And taken from the 2023 Tim Hortons franchise disclosure document, your territory is basically your store. Tim Hortons can open a competing store wherever it wants to, even right next door to you, should they want to do that. Now, it's very unlikely they would ever do that, but Tim Hortons corporate has been quite heavy-handed against franchisees in the past. More on that in a minute. And number 4, Tim Hortons is no longer a Canadian-owned chain. Burger King purchased Tim Hortons for $11.4 billion back in 2014, and they actually became a subsidiary of the Oakville-based Restaurant Brands International. And RBI is majority owned by a company from Brazil. It's called 3G Capital. And side note, just want to let you know, the Subway franchise chain, you may not have heard this yet, not a lot of news out there. Subway chain may be sold in the near future. They're looking at offers in the $10 billion range. Apparently, that's actually less than RBI paid for Tim Hortons. And you'll want to subscribe if you want to hear updates on that potential sale. Now, back when RBI took over Tim Hortons, many analysts and ourselves as well suggested this company takeover is likely to have overwhelmingly negative consequences for Canadians. And that was actually a quote from Canadian Policy Alternatives study. Now, the study analyzed 3G Capital's past history of takeovers, and those included Burger King, Heinz, and Anheuser-Busch. And they stated it has a 30-year history of aggressive cost-cutting, which could hurt Tim Hortons employees, small business people, Canadian taxpayers, and consumers. Now, almost a decade later, some might suggest this statement was remarkably prescient. And number 5, and for the folks who've been going to Tim Hortons for a longer period of time, you'll know about this. Tim Hortons food is no longer baked in the store. More than a decade ago, Tim Hortons actually switched from baking fresh in store to having their goods partly cooked off-site. They're frozen, then they get delivered to stores. And this helps corporate as they make good margins on these baked goods, but franchisees not so much. And in 2008, there's actually a class action lawsuit over this switch to par baking for, and I quote, breach of contract, breach of duty of fair dealing, negligent misrepresentation, and unjust enrichment. And the lawsuit cited that franchisees' costs to produce a single donut literally tripled from 6 cents to 18 cents per donut. It required new equipment and other expensive investment. Now, that case was eventually dismissed. However, needless to say, franchisees were not happy making 3 times less on a donut than they had prior to this par baking and having to now buy all of their goods from corporate. And that brings us up to number 6. Many franchisees to this day are not happy with Tim Hortons. And just last week, RBI terminated the franchise contract of the president of a group that was representing unhappy franchisees. Ron Fox, he owned his restaurants for over 2 decades. He did something corporate didn't like. He was saying negative things about Tim Hortons, in his view, perfectly valid. So they just got rid of him, and they took his stores. Now, if you saw our 2018 video, we covered the $850 million class action lawsuit where franchisees sued Tim Hortons for bullying and intimidation. Now, the statement of claim read, since the time of the corporate takeover of Tim Hortons, the relationship between Tim Hortons and franchisees has become more adversarial than amicable. Now, Tim Hortons claimed this group was only a few disgruntled owners and has warned franchisees about spreading quote-unquote misinformation to the media. Now, the president of the GWNFA, however, suggests that over half of all Tim Hortons franchisees had joined in this battle against corporate. Now, Tim Hortons then seized the 4 restaurants of the president of the then GWNFA. Now, in 2019, they settled 2 lawsuits from franchisees for termination after franchisees agreed to adhere to policies on not speaking with reporters or engaging in behavior that could be seen as damaging to Tim Hortons' brand. Now, things stayed quiet for a few years, but franchisees are saying now they are once again at a breaking point. Now, back in the day, there was another $500 million class action at the time suggesting the company was gouging them on ad funds and were in general taking advantage of franchisees. Now, public sentiment towards Tim Hortons at that time as well, there's a lot of problems. We won't get into those right now. But Tim Hortons had dropped a massive 25 points in more than 45 spots in a corporate reputation study of which corporations Canadians admired the most. Tim Hortons had always been a top 5. Tim Hortons, Canadian iconic brand and institution, but that year they had dropped to number 50. And last but not least, number 7, stores are closing. And this data is taken from their FTD. 2015 saw net store closures of 122 stores. 2019 closed 71 stores. 2020, 23 stores. And this is just in the USA alone. They don't have a lot of stores to lose in the USA. Now, from 2014 to today, the USA Tim Hortons franchise system, they've gone from 880 stores to only 637 stores, and they're relatively new in the US. Now, seemingly, Americans just aren't as impressed with Tim Hortons as Canadians. So is Tim Hortons a good investment? Well, ongoing legal battles with corporate, public negativity, increased costs and lower revenues, premium locations mostly gone, and corporate ownership with a history of heavy-handed behavior against franchisees. So we don't make the decisions, we just bring you the information. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.